Hi, I'm Caroline Swanson. Thank you so much for joining me today for this short little talk on something that I find really fascinating and interesting about the yoga practice, and a topic that I'm kind of passionate about. And that is the idea or word asana. A little personal story to start us off. A few years ago, I was getting deeper into my yoga practice and specifically getting deeper into my meditation practice. And I heard that the meaning of the word asana is actually, when kind of directly translated as closely as possible into English, means to be seated, or maybe more specifically, the act of sitting. The word as, meaning a seat, and ana being kind of the act of doing. It's a suffix that is used to denote action, kind of the way we use ing in English. And I just found this really fascinating. It can also be translated to posture. I think that's something that we hear more often when we hear about the yoga practice. But this idea of asana, meaning to be seated, or the act of sitting, really just blew my yoga practice wide open. All my little animals have decided to come and sit with me in this asana today. They've decided to join us. It really blew my yoga practice just kind of wide open to learn this. I really started thinking about my meditation practice and my yoga practices in an entirely different way. I started to really lean into this idea of how is this an act of sitting? And I think it moved me away from a need to do every posture perfectly, or even to try really hard to do any particular postures. My yoga practice really moved from a space of trying to do really anything to this idea of sitting with myself. And I started to see my meditation practice in the same way. So my meditation practice moved from this idea of, trying to clear my mind, or trying to cultivate a sense of calmness, or again, trying to do anything aside from sitting with myself. And so my yoga and meditation practices just both became really a practice of being with myself wherever I am that day. And it's been a really beautiful way to look at yoga, and it's totally changed the way that I practice. And so I wanted to explore that idea a little further. I wanted to learn a little bit more about the origin of asana, how asana fits into yoga as a whole, and just explore that idea a little deeper. So that's what we're going to do today, and I think Watson's excited about it too. Let's dive in, should we? Before we start, I think let's take a moment to sit with ourselves. So gently closing your eyes if that feels good for you in this moment, or maybe just lowering your gaze, relaxing your eyes, and finding a comfortable seated posture that can be any kind of seat that feels good for you today. Maybe on your knees, maybe sitting up on a cushion or a block, whatever feels comfortable and easy for you today. And just bringing your attention to your breath, not trying to change it or do anything with it, but just observing, feeling the air as it grazes across your upper lip. As you breathe air in and out of your lungs, filling up and emptying out. And maybe bringing your attention to your sit bones, to your legs, to all the parts of you that are making contact with the earth, or the floor, or your mat, or your cushion or block. Feeling the earth hold and support you exactly where you are today. Feeling that support, that stability move up through your limbs, up your spine, up into your chest and your shoulders. Feel that stability and that groundedness move out into your arms and your fingertips, moving up into your neck and up through the crown of your head, just feeling really connected and rooted with the earth, and allowing yourself to be held right here, right now, in this moment, exactly as you are. Slowly coming back to the room that you're in, maybe bringing some movement into your fingers and your toes, maybe rolling your neck from side to side. Finding any kind of movement that feels good as you feel supported here. Whenever you're ready, blinking your eyes open. Hi. Let's talk about asana. Let's talk about it. So something I want to point out right away and remind us all as we talk about asana is that it is just one part of yoga, 1/8 of yoga. So we have Patanjali's 8 limbs of yoga, and asana is only one of them. It does happen to be the most popular, and it does seem to be a good entry point for many people into yoga in our modern culture, but it is just one part, and it kind of gets the most hype, it gets the most attention. But I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that there are so many other aspects of yoga that are equally as important, and that we can maybe use our focus on asana and the popularity of asana to support and work with those other limbs of yoga, and that they all work together like the beautiful branches of a tree. So something that I just want to remind us as we go into this. A little bit of historical context, I think, is a good way to take a look at this. And I researched the origins of the word asana, and I researched the history of asana within the yoga practice and tradition. And it's really interesting. So we see a clear delineation between the 20th century and then kind of everything before 20th century. So there was a big shift in the 20th century towards asana, towards the expansion of asana. And before 20th century, we see a lot less of that, though it was slowly developing through time. So I've kind of divided the history into everything that happened before the 20th century and then everything that happened after the 20th century. So the earliest mention we have of asana is in the Bhagavad Gita, so around the 4th or 5th century, and it is described there simply as a seated posture to take in order to practice yoga. So that is the earliest mention we have of it. It specifically mentions being seated and describes it as a posture for yoga. So this is kind of very in alignment with the definition of asana that we were speaking about. And then we see it again in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras very soon after that. And Patanjali does not describe any specific asanas. Same as in the Bhagavad Gita, we don't have any clear descriptions of what an asana is or looks like. We just know that it is a seated posture. And in the Yoga Sutras, it's specifically described as a steady and comfortable posture. So I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of the asanas that we do today, we don't always think of as a comfortable posture. So I thought that's an interesting little thing to think about. So in the 4th and 5th century, we mainly see seated postures as well in any depictions of yoga that we have, which are few and far between. Prior to the 10th century, it is all completely seated postures. So kind of easy seat, Siddhasana. We see Padmasana, we see Virasana, the hero's pose, but all seated postures for meditation. In the 10th through the 13th centuries, we start to see this idea of asana expand slightly, but not a lot. We have our first appearance of a non-seated posture in Vimanakara Kalpa. And I'm probably not saying that correctly. We actually get our first appearance of a non-seated asana in this early text on Hatha Yoga that I keep trying to pronounce, and I'm gonna stop trying to pronounce because it's just too hard. But the first non-seated posture that we actually see, the first non-seated asana, is Mayurasana, our peacock pose, which I think is really interesting because it's like a really, really hard asana. So it like goes from seated postures to like peacock, which is a big jump, I feel like, big leap. But that's where we first see in a text our first non-seated posture. And around this period, the 10th, 11th century, we start to see artwork as well that depicts other non-seated postures. So we have some balancing asanas. We start to see headstand depicted in the artwork. So a few other asanas start to emerge. And then this idea appears in the 13th century in the Garashka Sataka. In this other early Hatha Yoga text, this idea emerges of 84 asanas in this text. And 84 is really a symbolic number at this point. It's not taken super literally. The idea being that there are 84 species on Earth, and so there is an asana for every species. So it's kind of like this symbolic idea. He does not actually, the author of this does not actually mention any specific asanas except for, I believe, 2 asanas are mentioned in this, but the 84 are not listed. They're just, the idea of 84 asanas is introduced. So moving into the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, we see a real expansion within Hatha Yoga of a lot more asanas. A lot of different asanas appearing in the artwork, in the texts, closer to that 8400 number of asanas. And it just keeps growing and growing. In the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, it still states though that there are 4 that are the most important asanas, and they are all seated postures. And those are Siddhasana, which is our easy seat that we're in already today, that I'm in. Our Padmasana, which is a full lotus pose. Vajrasana, which we would know now as Baddha Konasana, our bound angle pose, and Simhasana, which is actually a very interesting asana if you have not heard of it. It's a bit like a Virasana, like our hero's pose, and it's very cozy to be in a hero pose on a cushion. But it is a lion's pose, so it's seated similar to a Virasana, and then you place your hands kind of on the front of your knees out, and you're meant to do like a lion's breath in this asana. So you would inhale, and then stick your tongue out like a lion, so you're being like a lion. Or like my cat who's wandering around. It would be like her too. So those were the 4 that were listed as the most important in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which I think is really interesting. So the seated are still seen as the most important. But we see a few more texts appear at this time with a lot more asanas. This Hatha Ratnavali is the first text to actually list out those 84 asanas. But we still don't actually have a complete list of what those 84 asanas are anywhere, because 4 of them couldn't be translated at all. Many of them we do have descriptions of, but 11 are not described at all, and 4 are described, but the translation can't really be done. So we don't have a complete list of what those 84 asanas are anywhere, which I think is really interesting. We will never know what they are. And another book at this time, the Garanda Samhita, actually states that only 32 of these asanas, of the 84, are useful in the world of mortals. So many of them essentially cannot be done, I think is the idea. But I think this is really interesting. We still see mostly seated postures, and those are seen as the most important to the practice of yoga. But we do start to see the kind of catalog and the list of asanas grow and grow and grow from this point on. And then, as we learned in our earlier modules, from the 1850s and kind of onwards, we really see a big explosion in the number of asanas. As yoga starts to become kind of a part of this culture of physical fitness that many people are trying to promote throughout India at the time. So in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, we start to see kind of a slow growth of the number of asanas. We start to see different kinds of asanas and non-seated postures. But from the 1850s on, we get a real push into the 20th century of a lot more asanas. So that actually takes us into the 20th century, where we get a lot more, and we get the work of Krishnamacharya in the 1930s and 40s, and it is thought that he actually developed a lot of the asanas that we do today, most of them. Some of them don't appear in any text or recorded anywhere until the 60s, and a lot of his students started spreading them, but it is thought that he developed a lot of the asanas that we do today, and we'll actually look at those in a minute. But many yoga scholars, including Mark Singleton and a lot of other yoga historians, believe that Krishnamacharya was actually influenced heavily by gymnastics and calisthenics, which were becoming very popular worldwide at this time. And Scandinavian gymnastics specifically had, at that point very recently, kind of come to India, and that they believe that a lot of his asanas are very heavily based on Scandinavian gymnastics. In the 1960s, we have 2 texts, one by Iyengar and one by Sivananda Saraswati, Light on Yoga and Divine Light Invocation. And this is the first appearance of much of the modern yoga asanas that we do today. So a lot of the typical asanas that you would think of in a yoga practice first appeared in either one of these texts, which both were published in 1966. And this is just an interesting quote from Mark Singleton to kind of wrap this up. And he says that asana was rarely, if ever, the primary feature of the significant yoga traditions in India. So it's kind of a supporting piece, but not really that important is the kind of gist that we get. And it becomes more important in the 20th century, and as we move more into this culture of physical fitness. But prior to that, it really was one of the smaller parts of yoga. And so we've seen a really big shift coming into the 20th century, I think you would all agree, whereas asana is a huge focus now, especially in modern Western yoga. And it was such a tiny part, just barely mentioned as what you should do with your body while you meditate or do pranayama or recite mantras. So an interesting shift. So just looking at a few of the different asanas, I thought it was really interesting to kind of explore this idea of which of our asanas are more traditional and originated pre-20th century, and which ones were developed by Krishnamacharya and his students, which ones have been developed since then. And I found some interesting information. Norman E. Sjoman, who is a Canadian scholar of yoga, suggests actually that generally a way to be able to sort of tell, and this is a loose rule, it's not a definitive, but a way to be able to sort of tell if an asana is traditional or if it's more of a modern asana is that traditional asanas are generally named for objects, for legendary figures and for animals. So not a hard and fast rule, but something that might be able to help you tell. So some of our asanas that were named for our sages or our historical figures or our legendary heroes, like Hanumasana, our split pose, our monkey pose, would be actually probably a more traditional asana, as it was named for Hanuman. And we know that Mayurasana appeared very early in the 10th or 11th century, our peacock pose, named after an animal. Actually, scholars very recently found two texts that have changed thought around this a little bit. And those texts include seated poses, standing poses, and even balancing and dynamic postures. I thought that was really interesting, having dynamic postures in this kind of earlier period. We also see the use of props in this period as well. So they're using blocks in many of these images, in these texts, and they're even using ropes, which I think is really cool. So like maybe aerial yoga originated in the 17th century. Maybe it did. So I thought that was really cool. The actually earliest mention we have in a text of a sun salutation is 1893. I thought it would be a little earlier, and maybe it had appeared in this hatha, like earlier hatha yoga period, or in the 15th, 16th century. But the earliest mention in a text that we have of a sun salutation is in 1893. And it actually warns against doing too many of them in fear of getting injured, which I thought was interesting. We certainly do a lot of them now. And it's widely believed that Krishnamacharya developed our warrior series, developed Trikonasana, and even possibly named or first used the terms that we use for downward dog and upward dog. We do see depictions of these poses a little earlier, but the names that we use for those asanas now were developed at around that period of time. And then we have some that are likely like late 20th century, early 21st century asanas that have just been developed. A couple of specific ones that I thought were really interesting, and I wouldn't suspect, were our reverse warrior. I've also heard it called exalted warrior. So that reverse, that lean back in our warrior 1 or warrior 2 pose is actually possibly even like a very late 20th century or even developed in the 2000s pose. And then our revolved side angle as well was actually developed later. And that's something that Sjoman says in his mention of how to tell between traditional asanas and modern ones, is that modern poses, ones that describe the shape you're making with your body or of movement that you're doing, so a lot of our rotated or revolved poses are actually very, very modern and very recently developed. So on that note, can you think of any asanas that are likely very modern inventions? And when do you think they were developed? I'd love to hear what you think. A couple that immediately come to my mind are banana asana. I always know that can't be a traditional asana, right? Because it's used as an English word. And it actually, I did a quick little search, and it seems to have originated with the yen practice. And the yen practice, the yen yoga practice, was really developed in the 80s. So it's a very recent practice. So that one I always assumed would be a more modern thing, probably developed in the 80s or 90s. So, a little bit about the spiritual purpose of asana, since we really know that asana was not seen as something for physical exercise like we think of it now in a lot of spaces. So many yoga historians, including Singleton, Sjoman, and Andrea Jain, all describe asana as a platform for pranayama, mantra, and meditation. And that's what was really thought of in early yoga practices. They promote this idea that asana was thought of as a means to prevent mortal decay. So this idea of keeping your body healthy, and this idea of karmic accumulation or preventing karmic accumulation. So preventing negative karma from kind of building up in you, right? So to release energy, perhaps. Andrea Jain specifically calls asana tantric manipulation of the subtle body. And then Sjoman has a point that I think is really interesting. He delineates or differentiates between a dormant body and a relaxed body. And that yoga is aiming for a relaxed body rather than a dormant or like a one that isn't doing any movement. And so he claims that only a muscle that is worked can relax. I thought that was a really interesting concept. So I have a few quotes from a few different historians and individuals and writers about yoga, just to think about how asana fits into our yoga practice. Teos Bernard, who was an early yoga practitioner in 1944, mentions that he was assigned a group of asanas calculated to bring a rich supply of blood to the brain and to stretch, bend, and twist the spinal cord. And that the goal was to gain control of the breath to enable pranayama to work. So I thought that was really interesting, this idea of bringing blood to the brain and kind of mobilizing the spinal cord. And that all of this was meant so that pranayama would eventually be effective, or that he would be able to do pranayama better. So that was really interesting. And that's a theme we'll see in these quotes, that the asana is meant to prepare the body for pranayama or meditation in some way. Satyayanda Saraswati, who was one of Shivananda's students, says that placing the physical body in positions that cultivate awareness, relaxation, and concentration is the goal of asana. I like this as well because it really mimics Patanjali's point of steady and comfortable postures. I think it promotes this idea of being comfortable in a posture, not doing an asana that is going to bring us pain or any kind of really heavy discomfort, but that the goal is to be relaxed and aware. I really like this idea. And Iyengar mentions a steady and pleasant posture, or asana, produces mental equilibrium and prevents fickleness of the mind. I thought that was interesting. I would love to explore more about what he means by that. But he also says something that I really love, that students take the form of different creatures from the lowest to the highest, not despising any, for he knows that throughout the whole gamut of creation, there breathes the same universal spirit. And I love this idea of asana as of taking different forms of objects and animals and sages, and taking on that and as a way to understand kind of this idea of oneness, this idea that we're all the same and part of the same universe. And then finally, Leslie Kaminoff, who is the author of Yoga Anatomy, says that asana is a methodical way of freeing up the spine, limbs, and breath so that the yogi can spend extended periods of time in seated meditation. So again, this idea of preparing the body in order for the body to be able to be still comfortably, which is an idea I see echoed a lot when we talk about asana. So how can we apply these ideas to our own yoga practices? Just a couple of things that I thought of that really stood out to me while I did this research were that ensuring that we're comfortable in postures, so using lots of props, using blocks, straps, walls, chairs, whatever we got, and not pushing our bodies too far. So maybe challenging our bodies, but not pushing our bodies so far that we are not comfortable and that we cannot do our other practices. And the second point that I have here is just something that I think of a lot, which is to use the asanas as a means of practicing your pranayama or practicing meditation. So just to dive a little deeper on that for a moment, I think I like to think of, if I'm in a difficult asana, of using it as a way to challenge my own control of my breath. And my breath retention and my pranayama practices. How can I remember my pranayama? How can I practice my breath work in kind of, it's like putting myself under stress and practicing that pranayama under stress. Putting myself in like an extreme situation to make it harder to practice my pranayama so I get better at it. And then also a way of practicing meditation. I really love a repeated sequence for this reason, because doing repeated movement over and over can really help me be in a meditative state and use my asana as a moving meditation. So something that I would love for you to think about, I'd love to hear your opinion on, is how would you as a yoga instructor try to honor this kind of foundation of asana as a posture that we take to work on our breath work or work on our meditation? And how would you kind of weave these ideas into a yoga class? So maybe taking one of our quotes that we had, or one of the ideas that was brought up in the history of asana, and thinking about how we would incorporate that into one of our yoga classes that we're teaching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe leave a comment if you have like a really cool idea. I would love to hear it. And one last thing I do want to mention before we go is concerns around a cultural appropriation. So I think this idea of asana having become really popular and the focus of a lot of yoga practices and classes, especially in the Western world, has been a hot topic lately because of cultural appropriation. And as yoga teachers, we want to make sure that we are honoring the roots and the practice of yoga. And so I think I just wanted to mention this and have us think a little bit about how we can bring the whole of yoga and the history of yoga into our yoga classes. And I just found this quote from an article that I can link below. The article is called Investigation of the Cultural Appropriation of Yoga. This quote says, "A large contributing factor to the cultural appropriation of yoga is when Westerners decide to focus singularly on the asanas, overlooking any spiritual or intellectually relevant aspects. They contend that by choosing to advertise yoga mostly as a physical practice, those that have been oppressed for practicing it spiritually under British rule are continuing to be shackled by oppression because the spiritual practice is being invalidated presently." Johnson and Ahuja, which were the researchers that this article drew their work from, claim that this physically focused view of yoga can undermine the original meanings of the practice. So just something to think about as we build our yoga practices and as we do our own practices. So, and that is all I have for you. Thanks so much for listening and for exploring asana with me. And I hope that you learned something and you enjoyed it. And I'll see you guys soon. Bye.